Hello, everyone. I'm Max. This is Heather, and that's Pitar. And today we're going to be discussing the different elements that influence Gunnison Sage-grouse habitat: water, earth, and fire. While most people are more familiar with the greater sage-grouse, the Gunnison sage-grouse was recognized as a distinct species in 2000 through the valiant efforts of our own Dr. Jessica Young. Since then, the community within the Gunnison Basin has rallied around the recovery of our unique bird species while also considering the ranching and recreational industries on which our community depends. This has led to a cross-boundary approach to Gunnison sage-grouse restoration work that allows for open doors for opportunities for students and the community members throughout our valley.
The Gunnison sage-grouse is a sagebrush obligate, meaning it relies on sagebrush steppe habitat to survive. In fact, it resides in the sagebrush habitat year-round, even during Gunnison's brutal winters. So looking out over the sagebrush, many see a uniform landscape with little variation, but that's not true. The habitat is actually a complex mosaic of elements that meet grouse seasonal requirements. So in early spring, they use open areas or bare ground as lek sites where the males go out and dance for the females. Nesting sites are found within a few miles of those leks and require adequate sagebrush understory to conceal nests and chicks. In summer, wet meadows provide flowering herbaceous forbs and insects to feed hungry broods. And in winter, they find tall sagebrush stands in deep snow until they are ready to dance again the following spring. The sagebrush habitat over time has been degraded by a variety of influences such as human development, recreation, invasive species, relentless drought. The list goes on and on. As you can imagine, degraded habitat makes survival difficult for wildlife species. The Gunnison sage-grouse in particular has a shrinking population, and the species occupies less than 10% of its historical range. And in 2014, it was federally listed as a threatened species.
Fortunately, there's been a highly collaborative long-term effort across multiple agencies, largely community-driven, that has helped the conservation efforts for the Gunnison sage-grouse, and a lot of people in this room have been a part of that effort. So the presentations in this panel will represent some of those conservation efforts and some of the research that has been incorporated into those conservation and restoration efforts. So this will focus on wet meadow restoration, vegetation, and wildlife response to that restoration, and the effects of fire within Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. And I also wanted to mention that these projects are locally focused on the Gunnison sage-grouse and their habitat in the Gunnison Basin, however, represent global ecological change.
All these projects benefit not only the Gunnison sage-grouse, but all of the biotic and abiotic communities in the Gunnison Basin. By taking a basin-wide approach, we can connect our communities and promote future resilience. So I'll start off our panel today by talking about our first elements of Gunnison sage-grouse habitat, which is water. Excellent. So my MEM project focused on adaptive restoration approaches aimed at boosting resiliency within wet meadow and riparian habitat areas throughout the Upper Gunnison Basin. For this project, I partnered with the Bureau of Land Management Gunnison Field Office and the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District to plan, implement, and communicate restoration of these habitat areas for the benefit of the federally threatened Gunnison sage-grouse. So let's start with a quick background on the project. In 2009, the Gunnison Climate Working Group came together to discuss building ecological and social resiliency within the Upper Gunnison Basin in the face of a changing climate. In 2011, the Nature Conservancy picked the Gunnison Valley as a location to try out a collaborative, multi-purpose, landscape-scale ecosystem restoration project. In 2012, the Meadow and Riparian Restoration Project began with the goal of improving riparian habitat degraded to historic land use by increasing groundwater recharge and boosting riparian vegetation density. Bill Zedike, long-term practitioner of river, wetland, and riparian habitat restoration, was brought on the project early to help share its restoration experience and help practitioners in the basin develop strategies for the restoration project. A key aspect of Bill's restoration approach was tailoring restoration to the local landscape by reading the landscape to identify unique site characteristics and challenges. One common landscape challenge or impact that we see is old roadways that capture and channelize runoff, thus promoting soil erosion and lowering water tables. Reading the landscape and determining specific impacts at each site that we looked at was an extremely important aspect of my MEM project, because through that process, we've learned that there's no single restoration approach that works throughout the entire basin. So, as I mentioned, the habitat that this project sought to restore and protect is critical brooding habitat for the Gunnison Sage-grouse. And restoration efforts utilize different types of structures and different restoration materials at different areas. A couple of common restoration structures that we used are a low water crossing seen here. This one's paired with a worm fence to protect the meadow. Here we have another example of a worm fence. This one's at Upper Willow Creek, and it's paired with a sign to slow or disincentivize overland travel across the meadow. Next, we have a classic one rock dam structure, which is composed of many rocks, but only one rock high. It's a great structure for capturing soil and slowing erosion and promoting revegetation or repairing plant species. The next two photos on this slide are both at Monson Gulch. They show hybrid structures. At Monson, we utilized not only barriers and one rock dams, but we created new structures such as beaver dam analogs and hybrid wicker weir structures to disincentivize incision and spread water flows across the valley bottom a little better. So as you can see, these structures are low impact and they don't cost very much to build and maintain. So that means there's plenty of room for experimentation with structure design. So that's what I focused on during my project. And now we can go to the next slide. And where we have a map of our restoration sites. From right to left or west to east across the basin, we have Sappernair Mesa, Wolf Creek, 9 Mile Hill, and Chance Gulch, where we completed route decommissioning work. Which was primarily focused on building barriers to and installing signs to help bring connectivity back to the upland and riparian habitat areas by decreasing impacts of overland travel routes that contribute to erosion and habitat fragmentation. Next, we have Upper Willow Creek, where we surveyed the meadow for restoration work that will be completed this coming summer. Surveys included the preliminary development of restoration structure designs and completion of archaeological surveys of the site. Additional work at Upper Willow Creek included partnering with high country conservation advocates to host a volunteer work day, where we built the second worm fence in the previous slide, as well as a couple rock armoring structures and removal of fire rings at the site. Next, we have our Willow Creek and Polk Creek sites, where we focus on campsite delineation and meadow protection. Both project areas relied heavily on the addition of new worm fences to reduce the impact of expanding campsites on creek banks and riparian areas. And Western Colorado Conservation Corps crews assisted tremendously with the construction of worm fences across all of these sites. Finally, we have our Monson Gulch field site, where we conducted the entire wet meadow restoration process from surveys through to implementation. We worked with numerous partners at Monson Gulch to continue restoration efforts focused on expanding the wet meadow area at that site. Since Monson Gulch was my main project site, let's take a quick dive deeper into the details of that site. So Monson Creek is a small spring-fed perennial stream, which due to historic impacts to the meadow system in the form of multiple roadways and ditching for irrigation, flows through the meadow area as an incised channel rather than as a dispersed sheet flow across the valley bottom. In 2019, 51 classic Z-dike rock restoration structures were built at Monson Gulch. And in 2020, field assessments determined that the classic rock structures, which have proved successful in other areas of the basin which don't have perennial flows, were a little porous to capture the fine sediment at Monson Creek. So to address this, we developed methods to rework or expand some of the existing structures and plan new structures to help spread water laterally across the valley bottom. These new structures also were intended to reduce water velocity in the stream. For this, we prescribed beaver dam analogs, wicker weirs, sealed one rock dams, and sod seals for some of the existing structures. A beaver dam analog can be seen in the upper left-hand corner of this slide. A hybrid wicker weir structure can be seen in the lower left-hand corner. On the right, we have construction and follow-up of hybrid structures within the meadow area. So what we prescribed was all well and good until we started restoration work. And that's when the adaptive component of our restoration process really began. Pulling our site survey, I had a list of somewhere around 40 structures to build or maintain. And that list began to change the moment we started moving the water around at the site. So as I watched the water interact with the structures and shift course, I began to adapt the structures to meet the new flow patterns. In particular, this meant that instead of building just beaver dam analogs across the incised portion of Monson Creek, we began to expand those beaver dam analogs laterally across the valley bottom using wicker weirs. This created new hybrid structures that allowed us to better control the water spread and the velocity of the water. So at Monson Gulch, throughout the season, we built 62 new structures to re-wet about 5 acres of meadow. We were also able to visually observe riparian vegetation and wetted area expansion following restoration. Throughout our entire field area, we installed 42 closed drought barriers and signs, 7 worm fences, and 1 low water crossing. Over the past 10 years, the Meadow and Riparian Restoration Project has built over 2,100 restoration structures, restoring greater than 32 stream miles and approximately 140 acres of wet meadow. Restoration projects have also restored over 1,500 acres of Gunnison Sage-grouse brood-rearing habitat, and in restored areas across the basin, wetland plant covers has increased an average of 160%. This work could not have been possible without volunteers and crews. This season, we were joined by volunteers from High Country Conservation Advocates, Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, and the MEM, as well as crews from Western Colorado Conservation Corps, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and the STORE Corps. So trial and error was the biggest lesson that I learned through this project, and especially emphasized was the need to adapt our restoration processes based on changing conditions at our sites. At Monson, learning the landscape and flow pattern changes were critical for building effective restoration structures. In fact, we revisited the hybrid beaver dam analog wicker weir structure in the bottom left photo of this slide 4 different times to adapt and expand our design in order to better capture and spread water. Looking ahead to this summer, first year MEM student Peyton Manis will continue this MEM project and will revisit our field sites to assess and determine how our new hybrid structures perform during spring runoff. And since this is not a one and done restoration approach, this analysis will ensure growth and maintenance in our restoration activities for the upcoming season and for seasons to come. So, as for continued monitoring at all of our sites, we have vegetation transects and photo points monitored annually by the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, soil moisture sensor monitored by Master of Science and Ecology students, tipping buckets to record precipitation monitored by the Bureau of Land Management, and wildlife cameras monitored by Colorado Parks and Wildlife, as well as some groundwater wells and other implementation. So I hope that the data that we gather at all of these sites will be useful for promoting innovative restoration approaches, not only here in Gunnison, but across the West, and hopefully even beyond that. However, we have to remember that as we're doing this work, we're still looking to continue to develop innovative restoration approaches in order to promote resiliency within our landscapes, because our goal through adaptive restoration is not simply to restore these critical habitats back to their former states, but rather to restore these habitats to a state in which they will have increased resiliency to future changes. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I want to thank all my partners and stakeholders. So there's a lot more than are listed on this slide, but especially I'd like to thank Andrew Rupert, my supervisor at the BLM, and MJ Pickett, my faculty advisor. So, and then all the other partners we have here, as well as everybody else that came out and helped me. So there's one more slide. All these folks, all of our volunteers and crews could not have done without you. I spent a lot of time out there trying to do stuff myself, and it's just not nearly as fast without your help. So thank you all so much. I should have time to take a couple questions now. I can take more at the end too.
So I have a lot
So the question from Rich was, he said social media has a lot of quote unquote solutions for us, but what do I suggest for those of us that live in the semi-arid climate, and what can we do for our own lands? And I would like to say that it really starts with reading your landscape. Each individual site is going to have its own unique characteristics and challenges. So going out there, really knowing what you have to work with, what your materials are, what the water does as it moves across the landscape, what time of year it moves across the landscape. And that could be changing. So going out there, figuring out what you want to do, and then trying out some new things. As I said, we didn't spend a whole lot of money or a whole lot of energy on these restoration approaches. So there was plenty of room. If they didn't quite work as well as we wanted to, we could change them and fix them up and adapt them and make them work a little bit better. So go out there, work with what you have, see how it works, and keep trying. Josh. Yeah, so Josh's question was asking about fish species and adverse effects of beaver dam analogs, so artificial beaver dams on fish, where they might affect or positively affect the meadow system for things like sage-grouse or grazing ungulates and whatnot. I did cut out the presentation. Monson Creek is a tributary to Chimichi Creek, and obviously Chimichi Creek flows into Gunnison, so it's part of the whole Upper Gunnison watershed as well as the Colorado River watershed. But due to other impacts, Monson Creek doesn't really reach Chimichi Creek at a capacity that would allow fish to migrate upstream currently. That may or may not change in the near or far future. With the artificial beaver dams, and we don't use so many of those down lower here in the Sagebrush steppe. The Forest Service uses them a lot up by Taylor Park, where they probably have a lot more beaver. At Monson Creek, we saw evidence that there was beaver previously. There's not a lot of tree cover right now. Some of the trees are coming back. But by restoring the stream and using artificial beaver dams as an element of restoration, we're trying to bring that stream back around to a more healthy state where it's wider, there's more water on the landscape, so there's more opportunity for more species to come back. And if fish are part of that at some point in the future, that would be quite amazing, I think. With that, I'd like to bring Heather up to discuss her project.
Okay, so first let me say I'm freezing and I'm actively shivering. So I'm actually not that nervous. So I'm going to be presenting on the earth component of our water, earth, fire group panel up here, specifically vegetation and wildlife response, and more specifically, Gunnison Sage-grouse use of wet meadows, evaluating habitat restoration success for threatened species. Okay, so we already introduced this fabulous bird and the threats that they're experiencing. So 85 to 90% of their breeding population is here in the Gunnison Basin. And based on different population estimates, their range is between 2,500 and 3,500 individuals. These birds occupy the sagebrush habitat year round, and it meets different seasonal and life stage requirements for them. My project in particular is focusing on late brood rearing season. So that is different than early brood rearing season, which is closer to nesting sites. Late brood rearing season is found in mesic or wet areas of the sagebrush habitat, so like riparian areas and wet meadows, which is what I'm focusing on. And from a management perspective, late brood rearing season is mid-June to mid-October. So Max already so nicely introduced wet meadows to you, but I'll just say they differ from the surrounding sagebrush upland in that they're dominated by wetland vegetation. They're biodiversity hotspots for vegetation, insects, and wildlife, and they promote drought resiliency by keeping water on the landscape later in the year than the surrounding sagebrush upland. These meadows are critical for Gunnison sage-grouse broods in particular, because they provide an abundance and diversity of insects and flowering herbaceous forbs. The adults are capable of eating sagebrush year-round. They're opportunistic feeders, but the chicks and the juveniles absolutely require insects and flowering herbaceous forbs to survive and thrive and eventually enter the breeding population. But these wet meadows have been degraded, as Max was mentioning, by direct human influence, but also the broader issue of drought, which we know is getting much more severe here in the West. So the drought component that I looked at for my project was the Palmer Drought Severity Index, and it uses readily available temperature and precipitation data to estimate relative dryness. The scale now goes from +10 to -10. The more positive, the more wet, and the more negative, the more severe drought. So the chart over there on that side is the average annual PDSI for Gunnison County over the last 6 years. And you can see all those black bars are in the negative values. So we've been experiencing on average various magnitudes of drought over the study period. But then we have, there's been a highly collaborative effort to restore these sites and promote drought resiliency by putting in these low-tech rock structures, by reconnecting the floodplains, and hopefully promoting wetland vegetation and restoring habitat for Gunnison sage-grouse. So the wetland vegetation monitoring is sort of the middle component of between the restoration and the actual grouse response. And Colorado Natural Heritage Program has been diligently monitoring vegetation transects at sites that have received those restoration structures, as well as nearby transects that have not. And they've been able to show a significant increase in, wetland vegetation cover at sites that have these restoration structures. So we can kind of almost like check that box like, hey, we're seeing a restoration response for the vegetation, but now everyone's asking, are grouse benefiting from wet meadow restoration and how do we measure that? So that kind of goes into my project in particular. Since 2016, a wildlife biologist at Colorado Parks and Wildlife began putting out wildlife cameras on wet meadow sites throughout the Gunnison Basin. So you can see Gunnison there in the middle, and then the points are the cameras, and they're throughout critical habitat around Gunnison. As of fall 2020, there were 30 cameras deployed, 15 on sites that had received restoration structures, and 15 on sites that were not treated, but had shared similar characteristics and could be used as a comparison. The cameras are aimed at capturing that sagebrush wet meadow ecotone where you might have grouse dipping into the wet meadow to forage. And the cameras were running for the 5 months of brood rearing season from 2016 to 2020, and they were running for 24 hours a day. So that was how we sort of collected the data to answer the question, are grouse using the treated sites more over time in comparison to the untreated sites, with the theory being that if vegetation is increasing at the treated sites, maybe they might move into those sites eventually. So for the analysis, we were interested in grouse response as a function of 3 things: the site type, which is the treatment versus untreated, the drought index, which is the Palmer Drought Severity Index I mentioned, and then over time. So are they using the sites more over time? For perspective, this project has almost 3 million photos collected, and only about 6,500 of them are grouse. So it's really exciting when you get a grouse picture. So for the data set, we were able to refine all those pictures down into unique detection events. So as you can imagine, you can barely, oh, he's cut off, but there is a grouse right here, just a little guy. But as you can imagine, there's one grouse right there, and he's gonna have fewer detection events than an entire brood hanging out in the area all day. So now I'll just go over some raw data with you guys. So this is looking at the maximum unique detection events per trap day at both the treated and untreated. And the pattern that I want to point out here is that the annual variation at both site types is the same from year to year. And you don't see necessarily a mass exodus from one site type to the other, vice versa. And then what's really cool is when you look at this data on this graph, when they're superimposed on top of each other on the same scale. So that's the same data set, but now each dot is representing 1 month of the brooding season that year. And you can see the untreated sites have much higher detection photographic rate than the untreated sites, which are those orange dots at the bottom. So you can see the scale of how different it was at the untreated sites. And in fact, we only collected about 8% of our photos from the treated sites, which is maybe not what I would have expected. So then looking at this graph with the average annual PDSI on top of it, the higher the red X's on this graph, the worse the drought was that year. So the years, well, you can't see the years, but 2018 and 2020, where we had the highest grouse response, the average annual PDSI was the most severe. And in contrast, 2019, where we had the lowest response, that was one of the less severe drought years. So that's maybe one of our explanations. So then we used a mixed model approach to analyze the data. And we were able to show that in less severe drought years, there was a lower grouse response. So drought was the primary driving factor of grouse response. And this makes sense biologically because in a drought year that is less severe, that means the environment is experiencing more moisture. And so the sagebrush upland is more productive for them. It maintains forbs and insects for them longer. So they're less inclined to dip into the wet meadows. Where in contrast, in a much more severe drought year, the sagebrush upland dries up faster and they're forced to move into those wet meadows more. And then we get more detection events. And then, yeah, so grouse were photographed significantly more at certain sites. So I wanted to see our response variable at the 10 sites. The labels down there are our 10 sites. And then what's interesting to note is that these 3 sites drove the results of this study. And what's interesting about them is that they're all untreated sites. So there could be a couple things going on here. Is there some inherent characteristic of these untreated sites that are really valuable for these grouse? Or is it something more to do with grouse biology? And what I mean by that is their site fidelity. So they could be exhibiting site fidelity. What that means is they go where they know. They're incredibly site faithful as a species. So we know that they return to the same lekking sites year after year. Females will return to the same nesting sites year after year if they have a successful brood. So maybe this is just them going to the exact same late brood rearing sites that they know. It's safe. They're going to know where they go. Also on that, it could have just been a relatively short study for the target species. It was only 5 years. And maybe we need to extend the study and continue it into 10 and 15 years before we even see any sort of change in grouse behavior at all. But on that note, we probably won't see expansion into these new treated sites if we're not seeing an overall population increase, which we haven't been. We've been seeing annual decline in population. So what are the right parameters for future management efforts? So there's a lot of people and a lot of criteria that goes into deciding where they're going to put these restoration structures. All of it is for the goal to hopefully get these grouse to enter into these sites and we get more chicks to survive to juveniles to survive into the breeding population. So while so far we have restored some sites that we think we know they are, and we're hoping that they will move into them, now maybe we can use this information and have a little bit more of a targeted approach of where we're actually going to restore. So we could maybe do more preliminary surveys for grouse presence each year. We could also maybe use previously collected data like telemetry data to figure out where brooding hens are taking their chicks. If we do that, we would need to be conscientious of avoiding treating popular areas in the really severe drought years, because this data set has showed us that they need the wet meadows as much as possible in severe drought years. So we'd probably have to scale back our management if it was a severe drought year. And additionally, we could select months of brood rearing season with low use. So that would be like the end of brood rearing season, like September, October, if we want to be strategic of not disturbing the grouse as much as possible. So I will say this bird has gotten me so excited. And I explicitly put a female up here because I feel like the male grouse gets represented so much, but I love this little brown female bird. And while we have put so much emphasis on this bird, and I know we all care about it, it's important to note that these wet meadows are used by a wide variety of wildlife. We've captured dozens and dozens of species here. So the takeaway is we definitely need to continue restoring these wet meadows as much as we can, because we need to promote the sagebrush ecosystem health overall for not just grouse, but all wildlife species as we all experience this mega drought. And then I just want to thank mostly Nathan Stewart from Colorado Parks and Wildlife for entrusting me with this data set. And then there's been so many other people involved that I can't even name them all, but I want to name my committee: Dr. Jess Young, Dr. Mike Russell, and Dr. Madeline Vanderkirk. That's it. Thanks.
Some questions from the audience?
Oh. So the question was why I chose the Palmer Drought Severity Index, and then if I caught any grouse at night. So I chose the Palmer Drought Severity Index because I was able to get it on a reliable level. So I looked at some other metrics, like I looked at DSCI and Palmer Z Index, but based on my research, some of them said, like, you can't look at that on a weekly scale. That's too fine. You're not going to get the right, like, accurate trend. So I was able to get both monthly and annual PDSI for Gunnison County as a whole. And if I included it as Gunnison County, it kind of was like, it became a constant for all of the sites. So that's why I chose PDSI. And then for nighttime grouse pictures, we don't really get very many, if at all. Maybe at dusk, but not really.
Questions?
So now I am going to introduce Pete, who will be speaking about the fire element.
So it looked like this didn't work, huh? Okay, thanks, Bree. Okay, so my name is Pete. I'll be talking a little bit about my thesis work titled Using the Past and Present to Understand Fire Ecology and Sagebrush Habitats of the Gunnison Sage-grouse. First, I would like to show my gratitude for some of my collaborators: Jonathan Koop, Alice Margolis, Brian Stevens, Jessica Young, Manny Lopez, and our funding support from the USGS EMA Wildland Fire Program and the BLM Gunnison Field Office. So sagebrush landscapes are important ecosystems that occupy vast portions of Western North America, about 45 million acres. And the historical role of fire in shaping these systems remains poorly understood for many reasons. And sagebrush is critical for obligate species such as the threatened Gunnison sage-grouse. And about 85% of the Gunnison sage-grouse global population resides in the upper Gunnison Basin. If you haven't seen a Gunnison sage-grouse, here's one right here. So our main research question for this project was, what was the historical role of fire in sagebrush landscapes within the Gunnison sage-grouse range? So changing fire regimes is of great concern in the Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. We would expect that fire regimes and landscapes were altered by Euro-Americans over the last century and a half. So in the context of climate change, changing fire regimes, and changing land use, what can we learn from the past related to fire ecology that we can use for contemporary management? So we had two objectives in answering this question. The first, we wanted to reconstruct the fire history over multiple centuries of the upper Gunnison Basin using tree ring fire scars at sagebrush forest ecotones. And two, determine the effects of recent fires on vegetation within Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. And then lastly, bring the findings from these two objectives together to gain some insight into Gunnison sage-grouse habitat and the change over time. So our first objective, we sampled fire-scarred trees at sagebrush forest ecotones across the upper Gunnison Basin. So this photo on the right is an example of one of these ecotones. This is from Yellow Pine Ridge. That's Tomichi Dome in the background. Is at one of our fire history sites. So an ecotone is when one ecosystem meets another ecosystem, and that transition ecosystem is called an ecotone. So Here you can see the sagebrush meeting the forest, meeting the ponderosa pine trees. We collected 177 tree ring samples from 10 sites. You can see from our map here, all 10 sites were either within currently occupied Gunnison Sage-grouse habitat or directly adjacent. And we dated the year and seasonality of the fires using dendrochronological methods. So we were able to use tree ring fire scars to record the year and oftentimes the seasonality of historical fires. So on the picture on the right, it's a dug fir stump at one of our fire history sites at Iola Valley with multiple fire scars. And the photo on the right came from a living ponderosa pine tree from Old Monarch Pass, another fire history site, both in currently occupied Gunnison Sage-grouse habitat. So the sample on the right was scarred by fire twice in its life, once in 1798 and once in 1842. So trees put on annual growth, which looks like annual rings in the wood. And the trees put on less growth in dry years and more growth in wet years. And we see region-wide patterns in the growth between narrow rings and wide rings. So we're able to use those patterns to develop local chronologies and actually date wood, even though we don't know when that tree died, but we can recognize patterns within the tree rings to date those samples. And we can use those patterns to date when those fires happened, the years those fires happened, and not only the year, but also the seasonality those fires occurred in based on the position of the fire scar within the tree ring. So we found that there was a history of repeated moderate frequency fire in the upper Gunnison Basin. Site level mean fire return intervals was 41.3 years across the 10 sites. So each fire history site represented by this 3-letter code has a mean fire return interval. So an average number of years that fire returned. So the average of all those averages was 41.3 years and ranged from 18.2 years at the lowest to 79.7 years at the highest. So here's a composite fire history chart of the upper Gunnison Basin. So the horizontal black lines represent fire history sites recording. The vertical black tick marks represent fire events. On the bottom, we have our timeline from 1350 all the way to modern day. And on the bottom, that red horizontal line represents synchronous fires. So fires that occurred in 2 or more fire history sites, which is also represented by the vertical orange line. So as you can see from this composite fire history chart, there's a history of repeated fire in the upper Gunnison Basin for over 500 years. The site level mean fire return interval for fire burning synchronously between 2 or more sites. So on that red line there at the bottom, the mean fire return interval for synchronous fire was 23.6 years. So synchronous fire occurred on average every 23.6 years. Also notice that there's an abrupt cessation of repeated fire circa 1900, followed by over a century that was fire-free, which caused some sites to miss up to 8 fires. So you can see in the 1800s, we have frequent fire and that abruptly stops, where in the 20th century, we have absolutely no fire in our fire history. And that's due to Euro-American settlement, largely because of the introduction of livestock grazing, which removed those fine grassy fuels that characterize high-frequency fire regimes, and then later on, fire suppression. So I wanted to circle back to synchronous fire. So why do we care about synchronous fire? So this, these fire scars, the fire history came from sagebrush forest ecotones, trees at sagebrush forest ecotones. However, we are really interested in the fire history, the fire frequency of sagebrush adjacent to those ecotones. So if we have synchronous fire, two fire history sites that burn the same year with sagebrush in between those sites, or the same seasonality even, that'd be consistent with that adjacent sagebrush also burning that year. Also wanted to mention that in the 1700s and 1800s especially, we had the highest frequency of fire in the upper Gunnison Basin. And we don't have any data on Gunnison sage-grouse population numbers pre-1950s, but we do know, obviously, that the Gunnison sage-grouse made it through those 2 centuries. So we don't really understand how the Gunnison sage-grouse was influenced by those centuries, by fire in those centuries, but we know they made it through. Okay, so we were able to date 186, about 85% of our fire scars. Fire scars predominantly occurred in the spring. So 53% of our fire scars occurred in the dormant wood. So before this tree started growing. So that would be the early season in spring. And this trend slowly tapered off where we had very few fires that occurred in the late season. And early season fires are consistent with wind spreading those fires to adjacent sagebrush. So as you all know, it's quite windy here in the spring. So fires at those ecotones in the spring would be consistent with the wind spreading that fire to the sagebrush, adjacent sagebrush. Also, early season fire is prior to lightning season, which would be consistent with human ignition sources, indigenous burning practices prior to Euro-American settlement. On to our second objective. We conducted vegetation surveys, 50 in recently burned and 50 in unburned sagebrush sites. The burned sites came from 12 different fires from 8 distinct years, ranging from 2001 to 2021. We used BLM assessment, inventory, and monitoring protocols to assess vegetation structure and composition, which included line point intercept, continuous line intercept, and species richness. We then compared woody, graminoid, non-native, forb, sagebrush, and grass cover between the burned sites and the unburned sites. Okay, so here's a woody cover compared to a herbaceous cover in the burned sites and the unburned sites. So if you can see figure A, we have a significantly higher amount of woody cover in the unburned sites compared to the burned sites. And if you look at figure B, woody cover gradually increased with time since fire, slowly returning to that pre-fire state. Figure C, we have the opposite trend with herbaceous plant cover, significantly higher amount of herbaceous plant cover in the burned sites compared to the unburned sites. However, we did not notice a trend with herbaceous plant cover in time since fire. And I wanted to mention that this herbaceous plant cover is largely consisted of native perennial black grasses, and I'll talk about annual non-natives here in a minute. Okay, one more time. So here's a picture of the Rainbow Lake Fire, which was a prescribed fire, occurred in 2016, 5 years prior to this photo being taken. On the left is the burned area, on the right's the unburned area. And I thought it was a good picture to represent kind of the effects of burns. See the patchiness of sagebrush, the abundance of forbs and grasses. And anecdotally, we did see Gunnison Sage-grouse using these burned areas while we were sampling there. Okay, so on to annual non-natives. This is a big question with fire. In areas like the Great Basin, sagebrush landscapes of the Great Basin, fire is converting sagebrush landscapes to annual non-natives, which creates a fire cycle, and it reduces, it harms greater sage-grouse habitat in those areas. So we wanted to see how did fire influence annual non-native cover in the Upper Gunnison Basin, and we did find that there was a significantly higher amount of annual non-native cover in the burned areas, but we also found that there was more native plant cover in the burned areas as well. We saw no trend with time since fire for native cover or non-native cover. So cheatgrass is the big question here, and unfortunately, we're not really able to make any strong conclusions about fire and cheatgrass in the Upper Gunnison Basin because there just wasn't much cheatgrass at all. It's present at 3 out of our 100 sites, and 2 of those sites were unburned. 0.01% of our cover in the burned sites was cheatgrass compared to 0.09% in our unburned sites. So most of our fires we sampled were upslope, away from roads, away from trails where cheatgrass is invaded in the Upper Gunnison Basin. This could definitely change. The range of cheatgrass is climbing up elevation with climate change and future drought. So definitely needs to be monitored post-fire in the Upper Gunnison Basin. So out of our 109 species found in our plots, 5 were non-native, and those included cheatgrass, crested wheatgrass, narrowleaf plantain, common dandelion, and yellow salsify. Only crested wheatgrass was greater in the burn sites, accounting for this significant greater cover in the burn sites, non-native cover in the burn sites. However, crested wheatgrass is considered more a naturalized perennial grass, which was seeded here historically rather than a invasive non-native. Okay, so to summarize our findings, we had frequent synchronous fires, which is consistent with adjacent sagebrush burning. Majority of fires occurring in the spring when winds are high, possibly spreading fires to adjacent sagebrush, and recent burns exhibiting reduced sagebrush cover and increases in graminoids relative to unburned sites, with these shifts diminishing over time but persisting for at least 2 decades after the fire. So what does this all mean? So let's tie this all together. So in at least some portions of the Upper Gunnison Basin, the historical condition was likely characterized by patchy mosaics of recent burns. And the changes in historical conditions need to be considered when using the past to manage the present. We can no longer just take the frequency of fire historically and recreate that on the land today because of those changes from historical conditions with climate change, with drought, with changes in land use. So co-production between land managers and researchers is really important when using the past for contemporary management. So what does this mean for the Gunnison Sage-grouse? As mentioned before, the Gunnison Sage-grouse does depend on sagebrush, but their habitat requirements vary seasonally. So in at least some portions of the upper Gunnison Basin, fires created a patchy mosaic that potentially created Gunnison Sage-grouse habitat by meeting all those different habitat requirements in a small area. But again, I wanted to mention that we can no longer simply use the past for contemporary management. It definitely needs to be co-produced with contemporary research to understand the effects of fire. So future research should focus on those mosaics of sagebrush habitats and to really understand how fire influences Gunnison sage-grouse habitat. So I'll open it up for any questions.
Questions? Well done, Pete. Congratulations.
Thanks.
So then we have space for the panel. And this is the time for questions open for all the panelists, please.
So yes, it totally can scale. Oh, okay. So the question was, can these these research questions scale to other areas of Colorado, right? Okay. So yes, they definitely can. They already have. So especially all over the West, New Mexico. I don't know where else the wet meadow stuff has happened. All over the West, right? Yeah. So that's already happening all over the West, which I think is really awesome because the West needs it for sure. And then for my project in particular, it could definitely expand into that. And there's already been some other projects that have been out there trying to monitor grouse. You know, obviously let counts are happening, and there's also been flyovers looking for grouse. So yes, for I think both of ours definitely. And then I'm not sure about, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're kind of unique here where we do have 85% of the Gunnison sage-grouse here in the upper Gunnison Basin. The sagebrush habitats look a lot different in those satellite populations. So these implications with fire and fire history might look a lot different in those areas. But I didn't study those areas. I'm not really sure about the fire regimes and fire frequency. However, those trends in historical fire are not only widespread across Colorado, but across the western United States, where you see high frequency, low severity fire until the late 1800s, and that abrupt cessation of fire until modern day.
Awesome. So Emily asked us to share some of our most memorable field days since we all had field-based projects. That's kind of hard, spending a lot of time in the field all summer and into the fall. Like some of my most memorable would probably be working with crews and volunteers out at all our sites. It was just so great to have lots of people out there learning and working together to build these structures. I know we had fun with the MEM students out there. We had a couple weeks of cruise, and just being out there with all those other people and experiencing the habitat and the weather shifts, and sometimes we got to see grouse. It was really great. So that's not one memory, but it's a whole group of memories that create the best memory.
So I think seeing grouse is really special, especially when you see a brood. So I would say that was awesome for me. Another good thing is just all of the wildlife that you get to see. And I did most of my field work solo. So it's like just me, and I was really quiet, and I got to see some awesome stuff, including some really stubborn cows I came across that like prevented me from accessing. I almost got the truck stuck by myself, stranded, but yeah, otherwise it's mostly just the wildlife, which is so fun. And getting the pictures back and like going through all the pictures is like the best part.
Yeah. I'll share one, which I don't know if I should share, but I'll do it anyway. It was the end of a long day, and I've been cutting trees all day, and about to get back in my car and call it a day. And saw one tree with a lot of fire scars. I'm like, oh yeah, I'll get one more. It was like growing through the crown of another tree. So like I felled it, and then it didn't fall. It stayed in the crown of the tree, and I had already taken all my safety gear off. And so I was like kicking it to try to get it to fall. And then one of the branches fell in my head. And I'm like, oh, that hurt. And then like 3 weeks later, I got my hair cut, and my stylist was like, oh my God, what happened to your head? And apparently there's just caked blood in the back of my head, which I never know. Like I washed my hair, but it just never came out, I guess. So that was pretty memorable. Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, or should I repeat the question? So the question was similar trends across the Western United States of how we got to these points and these patterns of fire history. So some of these patterns are really widespread and really well documented. And I spent a lot of time in northern New Mexico getting trained up on endocrinology, and our project partners are down there. So they have a really interesting fire history in northern New Mexico and northern Arizona with really, really high frequency, low severity fire historically. Sometimes on the scale of 3 years. The fire occurred in 3 years. So our 41.3 years. Some of our project partners looked at that and they're like, "Oh, that's not frequent. That's moderately frequent." So, but yeah, these trends of obviously the big trend is the cessation of fire, 1800s, because of that removal of fine grassy fuels, changes in land use, the removal of indigenous people. And then later on, fire suppression. That trend is really widespread across the West. So I also found a lot of interesting trends with drought, and our synchronous fires lined up with drought. About 60% of our synchronous fires occurred on drought years. However, only 34% of all of our other fires occurred on drought years. Meaning that maybe on drought years, those synchronous fires represent that widespread fire events. Dry years means bigger fires, where non-drought years, lightning here and there might create many different individual fire events that might not spread to the entire region. So that was a similar trend that was seen in northern New Mexico and other areas of the West as well.
One question to continue about fire from Pat McGee. Your fire scar data comes from the ecotone, which might be at a relatively higher elevation than the core of the sagebrush ecosystem, at or below 8,000 feet. Could your fire intervals be biased toward higher frequency compared to lower elevation sites away from trees, and more lush vegetation understory in sagebrush. Also, info on the size of these fires. Also, why would humans burn sagebrush landscapes? Evidences.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, definitely. So that's why we really caveat our research with saying in at least some portions, these sagebrush landscapes were likely characterized by Apache mosaic. So some of these fire history sites are separated by 70 kilometers that fall and rise in elevation from the ecotone down to the low sagebrush, back up to the ecotone. And other areas are quite close. So between some of these fire history sites, we can be pretty confident in that the sagebrush between these sites burn, and in others, we really don't know the extent the sagebrush burned. So that was one question. The other was, why would humans burn sagebrush? Well, one reason humans would burn sagebrush is to increase grass cover. So if you're relying on big game for survival, burning sagebrush would increase grass cover and able to not only support big game, but also corral game and regenerate those grasses that could help support game. There's one other question in there, wasn't it? Maybe. Yeah, Pat, if there's one other question, you can ask me later.
And we have one more question and this is for the three, and Caspen Black asked, can you speak a little about the indigenous consultations you all did? Max mentioned archaeological surveys, and I know Peter has done some consultations. Would love to hear about that process.
So I did mention archaeological surveys. My extent that I played in that was finding the boundaries of where we were going to work. So I did not participate to a big scale in that. Otherwise, I know we had a meeting with all the project partners for the Upper Gunnison Resiliency Project, and we did discuss briefly the tribal consultation. I might have zoned out for that piece. So I didn't really, I know we have done it. I did not personally do it as part of my project. Being a project for a federal agency, it is required every time we do a NEPA document. So it was required when we did the overall EA for all the ZDEC structures. And I haven't read that document recently. I have read it, just not recently enough to remember what was in that section of the document. Maybe somebody else can speak to their project.
I did a little bit of Indigenous consultation. I was really gung-ho when I first started this project. I was like, you know, fire history is so cool. It's so cool to like look at fire scars and understand how frequent fire was historically. And I was really curious to what role human beings played in this fire history. I later learned that it's incredibly difficult to answer some of these questions. And a lot of this work has been attempted in northern New Mexico and other areas with much more frequent fire. But I had some conversations with you elders, and I got a range of responses of how fire was used by the Ute people historically, from was not used at all. Fire was a sacred thing, not to be controlled by man. It was a gift from the creator, to yeah, we used fire, but we used it to corral game and regenerate grasses, but it wasn't really a cultural tool. So you could see from our average fire return interval, 41.3 years, that would be, you know, once a generation, compared to 3 years in some areas, or, you know, in that realm. You know, if fire's being burned once a generation, it's probably not really a cultural thing, but maybe it's something that occurs every now and then. Yeah, so in terms of cultural stories surrounding fire from the Ute people historically, I didn't hear much about that, but And then we wanted to date some peel scars as well throughout the Gunnison Basin and see if they correlate with fire scars, but we were not able to get permission to do that. So these are culturally modified trees, and the U people are asking that these trees aren't sampled and used in academic work.
And we have from Emma McClure saying, great work all. I am curious what your next adventures will be. Will you carry on lessons from these projects into future jobs, etc.?
Yes, definitely. I think I was really fortunate to become a part of this project because it's really solution-based and it's collaborative. And that is why I came to grad school, was to be part of the solution in the future. So I think restoration and conservation is really important. And I think advocating for small little animals that aren't giant megafauna that get a lot of attention is really important. I will definitely continue this.
So I'll immediately continue this. I'm going to stay on with the Wet Meadow program and continue to work for the BLM and work with Peyton next year, or this coming season, I guess, to continue restoration. And one of our main project sites is Upper Willow Creek. So I'm really excited to actually get on the ground and do good restoration at that site. So that's my plan for the immediate future. And of course, I'll continue these lessons into future positions, wherever that takes me.
Thanks, Emma. And this project is really, really demanding. Very caused me a lot of stress and a lot of growth. So yeah, a lot of growth, but that being said, my immediate plans are going to be to relax and kind of heal from this process in the best possible way. So,
great answers. Questions from the audience, please.
Yeah, so Cheryl just asked a really hard question to answer about my thoughts on water rights as they're related to this project. And as she mentioned, this contentious issue, and water rights are a complex subject to begin with. So, you know, I didn't touch on it a whole lot in my presentation, but this is we have a lot of partners on this project, including private landowners, and being able to work with all of the groups, landowners, etc., that interact with the landscape is going to be really important. And then just being really careful about making sure that we're not holding the water on the landscape. We're not trapping it. It's the same amount of water. It's still moving through the landscape. It's just moving through the landscape a little slower and recharging the sponge that is the soil in our wet meadow systems. So it has a positive impact for the water resources in that, as we're seeing warmer, drier climates, and if the summers might see less of a monsoon season, being able to have that water in the landscape a little bit longer is really beneficial to not just the sage-grouse, but the plants and all the other animals and community members that use that space. So, we have to be very careful of it. I don't want to give like an answer to this. I don't have an answer for this. I think it's going to be talked about more in the probably pretty near future. And it's just something we have to consider and be mindful of in order to, continue this work and have it continue to be beneficial, not just for the bio communities, but for the anthropogenic communities as well. Yeah, so Phil asked, when I said I changed the Monson Gulch structures 4 times, it was in particular that was our first BDA, artificial beaver dam structure, and we changed it by expanding it and changing how we were doing our construction, and came back to that structure 4 times over the field season. So starting out in July with the Colorado Parks and Wildlife crew was when we first built that. And then we just, every time we came out with a new crew, we added on and made that structure bigger and more effective for spreading the water out across our landscape. And that was because every time I come back to it, I could see, hey, we can expand it and wet more area with this one structure. So it was just really fun working on that particular structure. Yeah. So Phil pointed out that coming back to each structure 4 times during a field season is probably not super sustainable for a full-time employee. That is very true. As a student, I had that luxury to come back and I only had one really main project site, and I was really focusing on it, adapting the structures to find what worked best. The whole program has the goal of coming back and checking the structures, making sure they're effective every year. And hopefully not have to, maintain each and every single one of them 4 times in a season. But by doing adaptive work, and now we kind of know what works better at some of these sites, we can start by building the structures more effectively from the onset. So instead of having to come back and adapt them, now that I've done some of that adaptive work, I've really felt out what's going to work really well, so we can build those structures, taking into consideration what I learned by adapting the structures throughout the season. I'm going to pass it over to Heather. Phil had a question for her as well.
So the question for me was I able to automatically remove ones that didn't have animals in them? Is that right? The answer is no. So these pictures were all gone through by hand, but it was technicians over the years. And then I think I've done about 500,000 photos myself. But they are motion and thermal activated cameras. So in theory, it shouldn't be triggered if there's nothing there. But then the occasional, branch getting sunlight on it will trigger it, and you'll get thousands of pictures of a tree branch. And you got to look through all of them, because you're also not just concerned with the tree branch, but there might also be like a secondary trigger of like one species in the background that you have to pay attention to. So yeah, it's done by hand. And I spoke to my committee about doing a software that could go through them and identify, but with how inconspicuous the birds are, it probably is not reliable.
And we just want you to know the grouse thank you all.
Thank you.
And I thank you too for the ways that you're helping us to understand this landscape in which we live, and those who don't live here understand these principles of resilience and how to live in the world in a more sustainable way. So thank you all for that. I invite the audience now to help me congratulate our new Master in Environmental Management, Max Sawyer. And stand up. There you go. Master of Science in Ecology, Heather Reynolds. And another Master of Science in Ecology, Pitar Simic.
Then we'll take a quick 10-minute break. And when we come back, we'll hear from our next panel titled The Integration of Identities, Equity, and Culture for Sustainable Liberation, featuring Katia Gonzalez, Annette Wilson, and Aaron Mercado.